Alan Hayek is Professor of Philosophy in the Research School of Philosophy at the Australian National University. His research interests include the philosophical foundations of probability and decision theory, epistemology, the philosophy of science, metaphysics, and the philosophy of religion. We were pleased to be able to interview Al about how philosophers view the unknown and what they do with it.
Al, my understanding of philosophy is that at least part of it is devoted to accounting for how we can know things. Does it also have something to say about how and when we don't know something?
Yeah. Yes, well, there's this whole branch of philosophy called epistemology, which is about the scope and limits of knowledge. Let's start with knowledge, belief as well, and other things. But yes, and so philosophers for centuries, even millennia, have challenged our entitlement to various knowledge claims. They think we don't know as much as we thought we did. And then various other philosophers try to run to our rescue to say, no, things aren't so bad after all.
Can you give us some examples of this?
Yeah. So, I mean, going back to the ancient Greeks with Pyrrho, who counseled us that we should suspend beliefs generally, certainly about what things are really like out there. One really famous skeptic was Descartes, who had these arguments that still persist to the current day, that really we don't know much at all. For example, we don't know much about the external world. So he had an argument from dreaming. When you're dreaming, things are not as you think they are, you know. If I were just dreaming that we're here in this studio talking, you know, I'd be wrong. We're not really here talking, it's just part of my dream. And his challenge is, well, look, when you're dreaming, you think that you're perceiving the world as it really is. You can't tell that you're dreaming. So maybe you're dreaming now. And then he sort of ramps that up with an argument from the evil genius. So maybe you're being the victim of an evil genius who, you know, plants in you these perceptions and so on. But in fact, the world is nothing like what you think it is. And then various philosophers fight back and they try to show, no, we do, after all, know stuff. So starting with Descartes, so he begins by saying, well, look, there's one thing that not even the evil genius could fool me about, the fact that I exist and I think, you know. When I have those thoughts, I really am right, and there's no way I could be deceived. So I do know those for a start. And then he goes on to prove the existence of God, or so he thinks. In fact, he does it twice. And then he thinks, God is like a guarantor of my beliefs, at least when I'm thinking, you know, clearly and distinctly, when I have these clear and distinct ideas, I must be getting them right. You know, God wouldn't let me be deceived about those things. Now, in a way, this is an example of what I think is a recurring theme, that the sort of negative skeptical arguments that we started with, that we don't know very much, are rather more persuasive than the attempts at solving them.
This kind of skepticism is pretty disabling, isn't it? You know, how can we make decisions, and how can we predict anything about the future and all that sort of thing? I mean, surely we have to do these things.
Yes. Which brings us to Hume, and another famous skeptic about predicting the future. So, you know, you think you know some stuff about the future. You think that you know the sun will rise tomorrow, for example. Okay? And Hume questions your entitlement to that knowledge claim. Okay, well, how would you justify your belief that the sun will rise tomorrow? And he says, well, either you could do it, as we would put it, deductively, like you could give a proof. You could give a demonstrative argument that the sun really will rise tomorrow. But you can't, because it might not. It's possible that it won't. Or you could give what we'd call an inductive argument, namely, you sort of just look at what's been true in the past, and then you continue projecting that to the future. So why do I think that the sun will rise tomorrow? Well, because it always did in the past. And how do I justify that? Well, with an inductive argument that, well, futures tend to resemble pasts or something. But that's the very argument form that's in question. That's question begging to appeal to induction when what's being challenged is induction by Hume. Bertrand Russell has this nice case of a turkey who every morning wakes up and gets fed by its farmer. And then one morning it gets up, oh, it's another day, the farmer's going to feed me. Wrong. The farmer wrings its neck. Well, the trouble is that the turkey is sort of projecting the wrong regularity about the past, because there's another regularity that farmers tend to wring the necks of turkeys eventually.
Okay, so we've got some very sweeping and powerful sounding arguments for skepticism. Are there any ways out of this? I mean, are there any good reasons to be able to say, well, we do know some things?
Yeah. So as I say, often the solutions aren't as convincing as the problem. So, for example, G.E. Moore would answer Descartes as follows: take something that I really know. I know that I have a hand, okay, and I know that more securely than I know the premises of some clever argument by Descartes. So when the two collide, when this argument is telling me I don't know I have a hand, I reply, look, this is what I really know. I do have a hand. Forget the argument. There must be something wrong with the argument somewhere. So, but some people think this is really just question begging. Descartes gave a pretty powerful argument.
So does empirical evidence have any role in this at all?
Yeah, well, when it comes to the problem of induction, there's the problem of, so what do you do with the empirical evidence? So you've seen all of this data. You've seen a whole lot of sunrises. You've seen a whole lot of days when the farmer feeds you. Okay, that's your empirical evidence. But now you want to do something with it, project it to the unobserved, to the future, for example. And again, the problem is, how do you do that? But then another reply, maybe this is worth mentioning now, is to say, stop getting so hung up about knowledge. Yeah, okay, you don't know that the sun will rise tomorrow. It might not. The turkey doesn't know that it will be fed another day. It might not. But maybe at least it can be really confident that that's going to be the case. Maybe we can be rationally confident that the sun will rise. And so that's how we might use our empirical data to, bestow rational confidence on us that things will go as we expect. High probability.
Oh, okay. So this is like the old aphorism that the race doesn't always go to the swift nor the battle to the strong, but that's the way to bet.
Yeah, well, exactly. And betting, is a form of behaviour, and there are rational ways to bet and irrational ways. And again, it seems probabilities are bound up with rational behaviour.
So am I right in thinking we've kind of moved from one set of arguments, which are the kind of sceptical ones that really get us thinking about what we can and can't know, to now about looking at another set of arguments which are around decision making and the role of probability?
Is that right?
Yeah,
I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah, you might call this a sort of probabilistic turn in epistemology. Some people would say there was too much focus on knowledge, and now we should switch to this other interesting topic, rational belief. And since beliefs seem to come in degrees, degrees of confidence, probabilities, and there's a whole sort of Bayesian story about how that works.
So what's the Bayesian story?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to say something about that. So for a start, we imagine, this is a bit of a fiction, but we imagine an agent who doesn't know anything, who's just sort of born into the world, blank slate, hasn't experienced anything. So let's call this agent Superbaby. Superbaby is completely ignorant at first, but she's really smart, and she's a really good learner. So when evidence starts coming in, when information starts coming in, she responds to that as well as she could, and she updates, she revises her opinions as it comes in. Okay, so Bayesians say that initial state of ignorance should be represented with a probability function. She should assign probabilities to all of the possibilities. And then as the evidence comes in, she should revise the probabilities according to a certain rule.
Okay, so where do the initial probabilities come from? I mean, we've got Super Baby, right? And she's considering whether the sun's going to rise tomorrow or not. She's never seen a sunrise. Yeah. So does she assign 1/2 to, either it will or it won't, or does she do something else?
Well, so the first answer from sort of orthodox Bayesians would be, it just comes from thin air. It's just whatever she feels like assigning. It's not based on information. So as long as her probabilities, mathematically obey probability theory, it's completely fine. So if she wants, she can give probability, 0.99 to the sun not coming up and 0.01 to it coming up, as long as the numbers add up the way that probabilities do. And then the thought is, but then she's going to update, using this conditionalization rule, and if she keeps on updating, then it won't matter how she started. But I should tell you, I'm pretty skeptical about that.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this right. If she, let's say, does assign probability 0.99 to the sun not coming up tomorrow, it's going to take an awful lot of sunrises for her to move away from that to getting to the point where she is assigning a very high probability to the sun rising the next day.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Bayesians like to say, well, in the infinite long run, we'll wash out the effect of that first set of probabilities, the prior. And then Keynes quipped, in the long run we'll all be dead.
So is there a way to get to a better prior quicker?
Good, yeah. So one thing some Bayesians do is to say, no, we have to constrain the prior. So there's something called the principle of indifference that might help. So basically, when you're faced with a bunch of possibilities, you should give equal probability. Okay, so remember the die case? So here's an unknown die. I'm going to toss it. It's got 6 faces. What's the probability of it landing, 6? Okay, so the principle of indifference says, well, 6 possibilities, equal weight, probability, 6th, 6th, 6th across each of them. So the answer's a 6th to that problem. So this is meant to help. On the other hand, it can give some startling results. Does this glass rule the universe? Yes or no? 50-50, either it does or it doesn't. So it looks like the principle of indifference is giving still a crazy answer, 50-50.
Well, can I put it back to you a different way? Yes. So is what you do as philosophers is kind of shake us out of our comfort zone because we can't make perfect decisions on these complex things. And when we think we can, you can come in and say, well, there's actually a different way of thinking about this, or there's a flaw to your argument. And what you're always doing is kind of, you're doing 2 things, I think, is one, shaking us out of our comfort zone, and the other is continuing to push us to try and make better and better decisions and have better and better understanding. Is that a fair way of thinking about what philosophy does?
I say a lot of philosophy is the demolition of common sense followed by damage control. Okay, so that the first part's the shaking that you mentioned. Yeah, so Descartes shakes us when he says you don't know much about the external world. Hume shakes us when he says you don't know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow, and so on. So that's like the first part. That's the demolition of common sense. And then, hopefully, a bit of damage control, as it might be, we don't really know certain things, like the sun rising, perhaps, but we could still function, even so, and as we've discussed, maybe probabilities come in there. So even in an uncertain world, even when we're ignorant of so much, we can still act. And we can act rationally thanks to, in this case, probabilities. That's the thought. That's the damage control.
Okay, well that's been great.
Yeah,
thank
you very much.
So much for doing this.
Thank you, and I can tell you there's still a lot we don't know even about probability theory, so in a way we've come full circle, because there's a lot of ignorance about that very topic, that very subject matter. So we're back where we started in a sense. Thanks.
Right.
Great.
Thanks.